scientists find it hard to believe in the supernatural. The resurrection requires a belief in the supernatural. If it happened, it changes everything. So it's a very important question.
Yes, well, of course, the popular claim goes extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So the resurrection is an extraordinary claim. And then the assumption is, well, I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary, but nothing you could possibly say would convince me that this actually happened. And so there's this ingrained assumption that the resurrection, or any miracle really, is inherently the least probable of all possible events. And of course, this is a very old assumption. This goes back to David Hume writing his dialogue on natural religion in the 1700s. But I think it's a failure to understand how probability theory actually works. So I won't get too technical for the audience here, but it's crucial to understand the difference between the so-called prior probability or the antecedent probability of an event before you look into the actual evidence and the probability after you've taken the evidence into account. And so I agree, it's true. The prior probability of the resurrection or of a miracle is low. There's a natural order of things in which dead men stay dead, something that the people of the Bible knew, by the way. They weren't just ignoramuses who assumed that dead people might just get up and walk any time. That wasn't something that just happened in the normal course of events. So yeah, we have a natural order in which dead men normally stay dead. But then the question is, okay, but what do I do with this data? What do I do with this evidence, with these reliable accounts? Is the probability of all of that evidence, given that Jesus rose from the dead, higher than the probability of the evidence given that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? If I compare those two things, I put them in a little fraction, a little ratio with each other, what's going to happen? And if that ratio is, we would say, top heavy in probabilistic terms, if the probability of the evidence given Jesus rising far outweighs the probability for the evidence if he didn't, then you're in business and you can overcome even a very, very low prior. And this, by the way, this isn't my own original observation. My mother and father have actually done technical work on this. They wrote a joint paper some years ago modeling this in probabilistic terms and going into some of the details. But that's what you have to do in the end. Because the thing about David Hume is he just sort of waved his hands and didn't bother with the details. And then he thought that he had made an everlasting check, was his sort of grandiose phrase. But that just won't wash probabilistically. You really have to get your hands dirty with the specifics of the case. And I think Christianity is more than up to the task. It's like Jesus inviting Thomas to examine the wounds. That's what Jesus says. He says, "Try me." And he's still saying that.
To those who would say, okay, so it might all be true, but we still all suffer, we all go through great agonies, and then we die. What does it mean? Why does it matter? What does it change?
Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life, and he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." And that verse, of course, comes from the story of the raising of Lazarus. And Jesus is speaking to Martha, one of Lazarus' two sisters. But the remarkable thing about that story is it presents the divine Jesus, but it also presents the human Jesus. And so in that verse, we have Jesus is giving Martha the great resurrection hope. But also in that story, we see Jesus is weeping. He's grieved. He's angry at death. And then when Mary comes and she says the same thing to him that Martha said, she says, "Lord, if you had come, my brother wouldn't have died." Jesus is overcome with emotion, and all he can say is, "Where is he? Where have you laid him?" So we see Jesus entering into our suffering, entering into our sorrow and our pain. But the hope of the resurrection is the sorrow and the pain and the suffering is not the end. And it's, the words of Sam from Lord of the Rings, everything sad will come untrue. And that's the promise. That's the resurrection promise. That's the resurrection hope. Everything sad will come untrue. And that's why it matters in the end. That's why it matters.